Okay, so today's topic is about aggregate demand and aggregate supply analysis. And though you might find this is similar to what we do in microeconomics, like when we study the demand and supply model, but let me tell you one thing, this is not the individual demand, this is not the individual supply, this is not the market demand, this is not the market supply. In fact, this is the aggregate demand in an economy and aggregate supply in an economy. So because we're studying macroeconomics, so this would be from the macroeconomic point of view that we'll discuss the whole demand in the economy and whole supply in the whole economy. Okay, so the learning objectives are basically we're trying to understand what happens during the business cycles. Like there are different phases of business cycles, like expansion and contraction, for example. So what happens to the macroeconomic aggregates in those business cycle phases, and what happens to the other macroeconomic performance during those phases of the business cycles. We also need to understand today what is aggregate demand and what is aggregate supply. Aggregate supply would be of two types, short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. And finally, we'll study the macroeconomic equilibrium and how the changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply can actually impact the macroeconomic equilibrium as we study in microeconomics. But the reference would be different here, because now we'll be talking about the economy as a whole and not the individual markets. So this is just a kind of repetition from the last lecture. So what are the business cycles? Business cycles are basically fluctuations in the economic activities, and there are two different phases of a business cycle, contraction and expansion, and there are two turning points, peak and trough. So what is contraction? Contraction is basically a significant decrease in the aggregate economic activity. When I say aggregate economic activity, so I'm talking about a significant decrease in national income, real GDP per capita, and the impact on the inflation and unemployment as well. The negative impact basically, because we're talking about contraction. And it also refers to the slowdown in the growth rate of the activity that lasts more than a few months. So if it is like all of a sudden kind of jump or all of a sudden kind of decline, we don't consider it as a phase. For a different for a phase to be a contraction phase, it must be a time period where the activities, they become slow over an extended period of time, basically. Contraction begins after we reach the peak. So once we reach the peak, that means once we reach the best possible point of the business cycle, then the next phase that we would be expecting in any economy would be a contraction phase. And it ends when we reach the other turning point, which is the trough. And recession, you might not be very familiar with the word contraction in the business cycles, but I'm sure you are aware of recession in a business cycle. So what is a recession? Whenever a contraction lasts for long, then around say 2 quarters, or when it becomes severe. So any severe contraction where the real GDP decreases for at least 2 quarters, then it is called a recession, basically. This is a hypothetical business cycle. So what we do when we talk about a business cycle, we take time on this axis and we take a real GDP here. This blue line is the trend line. Now, what is this growth trend line? This is a trend line that we expect for an economy. Means looking at the current scenario, looking at the available resources, we would expect that the growth should take place at this rate. But actually, real GDP might not grow at that rate. Sometimes the real GDP performs better than our expectations. Sometimes the real GDP performs not as good as we are expecting. So these are the fluctuations that are there around the trend line that we expect. And above, if the real GDP is more than what we expected, that means we are in the expansion phase, or we are touching the peak point there. If it is below, we are talking about contraction, or we can also call it as a recession, especially if it is below the trend line. And then comes the expansion phase again, and then comes the contraction phase again. This is a real, so previous slide I was talking about the hypothetical business cycle, and this slide I'm talking about the fluctuations in the real GDP growth in Australia from a time period 1960 to 2010. And there was a kind of recession here in 1990, and also you would see that there have been fluctuations all around the real GDP in Australia over the time period. So if you talk about the long run growth, you would see that the performance of the economy has improved over the long term, and the standard of living of the people has improved. But if you consider it again, if you consider the short term fluctuations, we would be able to understand that the real GDP actually fluctuates, and it was never the case that it continuously increased. So it dropped as well. But that is only visible if we consider the business cycle fluctuations. Recessions in the business cycles, or recessions otherwise, there could be two reasons for these recessions to occur in the economies or in the world. One would be because the contraction gets severe, so we get a recession phase, and another could be economic shocks, and these economic shocks could be the supply shocks, for example. So a few examples in the real world that led to recessions in the economy. For example, 1974, there was an cartel formation by the OPEC organizations, by the OPEC countries, oil petroleum exporting countries, and when they framed cartels, there was a price shock of oil, and that actually led to a kind of recession as well. 1982-83, high real wages and inflation, so that was another kind of problem that we had. So there was a continuous increase in the real wages, and hence there was an inflation. 1990-91, there was a property bubble, and 2001 there was a technological stock market bubble, and again 2008 and 9 that we all are aware of this recent kind of recession, which was world financial crisis, and there was housing price bubbles as well. So we understand what are the business cycles, but we also are interested in knowing what happens during a business cycle. So how does the business cycle affect consumption? How does the business cycle affect investments? So that means what would be the impact of business cycles on consumers? What would be the impact of business cycles on producers? And what would be the impact on inflation? And ultimately, what happens to unemployment in different phases of the business cycle? Now, inflation is a pro-cyclical variable. That means during the economic expansion, the inflation rate usually increases, whereas in the recession, the inflation rate goes down, unless the recession is because of the supply shock. So in the expansion, the prices would be increasing, and when the prices start declining, that is an indication that it might, if it stays forever or for a very extended or a long time period, then it might lead to recession in the economy. Whereas unemployment is counter-cyclical. When I say counter-cyclical, that means the relation is a negative kind of relation. So recessions cause the unemployment rate to increase, whereas in the expansion phase, the unemployment rate would be the lowest possible. Aggregate demand. What is this aggregate demand? So let's try to understand what is aggregate demand. This concept was basically given by Keynes. And when Keynes gave his employment theory of in prices, interest and money in 1930s, he actually gave a concept known as aggregate demand, and he stated that whenever recessions occur in economies, those recessions are basically a reason of that there is a lack of effective demand in the economy. That means there is a lack of aggregate demand in the economy. And if you want to face those recessions, the need is to push up the aggregate demand in the economy, and everything will be all right. So let's try to understand what is aggregate demand. So aggregate demand is basically the demand by all the people in this economy, right? So it would be the overall demand in the economy, and it consists of four components basically. So aggregate demand is equal to C, which is consumption. That means we are talking about the demand by households, or this could be the demand by anybody who wants to consume something. Investment, so this would be the total demand by the investors or the producers. Government expenditure, this would be the total demand by government. It could be government consumption, it could be government expenditure. And finally, the net exports. That means the demand by the foreigners for our products. So, it includes basically the goods demanded by all the consumers, all the investors, by the government and by the foreigners who are interested in buying our products. What is aggregate demand again? It shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. So basically, I would say here I'm talking about aggregate demand curve. So aggregate demand curve shows a relation between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. So aggregate demand curve shows the relationship between the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded. If you want to use your demand and supply models understanding here, you can use that. Now the demand curve says that whenever the prices would increase, the demand would decrease. And the same rule applies here as well. There is a negative relation between the price level and the quantity of real GDP, or the quantity of the output demanded by all the parties in the economy. So there is a negative relation. As the prices go up, the quantity of the real GDP, or the quantity of output demanded, goes down. So that is the reason that the aggregate demand curve is a downward sloping curve, because a fall in the price level increases the aggregate demand, as what happens with the normal or the demand curve in the microeconomics. Now, aggregate supply curve would be of two types, short run and long run. So short run aggregate supply curve is basically a curve that shows the relationship in the short run. So we're talking about a short time period here. So the relationship in the short run between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied by firms in the economy. Now demand talks about the price level and the quantity of real GDP demanded, whereas the supply curve talks about the relationship between price level and the quantity of real GDP, or the quantity of output supplied by firms in the economy. And when you take both together, that means when you take aggregate demand and aggregate supply together as a model, this would be a model that explains the fluctuations in real GDP and the price level, that is the business cycles. What happens when the prices increase and what happens when the prices decrease to the real GDP. I've already discussed this, and the note is the aggregate demand curve is not to be confused with the microeconomic demand curve. Though I told you that you can use that understanding here, but never assume that both are same, they are different. So aggregate demand is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. It's a negative function of price, and it's downward sloping. That means the higher the price, less will be the real GDP demanded in the economy. There are three reasons why there is a negative relation between price level and real GDP demanded, and those three reasons are wealth effect, interest rate effect, international trade effect. For example, wealth effect. So what happens is, when there would be an increase in the price level, it will actually reduce the real value of household wealth, and hence will reduce the consumption in the economy. So if the prices increase, the real value of the wealth holdings that I possess, that value decreases, and hence my purchasing power decreases, and hence the consumption decreases. Interest rate effect. So what happens is, when there would be an increase in the price level, it would raise the interest rate, because interest rate is an instrument that controls the inflation in the economy. So whenever there would be an increase in the price level, it would raise the interest rates. Why? Because higher prices means we now need more cash, or we now need more money to handle those transactions. So we demand more money in the economy, and when we demand more money, that means there is demand for more cash and demand for more money aggregates. So that would lead to increase in the borrowing cost, and hence increase in the interest rates, which will Because when the interest rates would increase, that means it would be expensive for the firms to borrow, and also it would be expensive for the consumers to borrow and spend that money. International trade effect: an increase in the price level causes imports to become relatively cheaper and exports to be more expensive. So whenever there will be an increase in the price level, the net exports will reduce. We make an assumption here that the government purchases are determined by the policymakers, and changes in the price level don't affect them. So that means when we talk about what happens with the price, what happens to different components of aggregate demand when price levels change, we don't discuss government purchases there, because government purchases are highly influenced by the policies of the government. So we leave that part here. Okay, so now remember the changes in the quantity demanded versus change in demand. So aggregate demand tells you the relationship between price level and quantity of real GDP demand. So if the price level changes, but other variables that affect the willingness of households or firms or government to spend money remains the same, then the economy will move on the same aggregate demand curve, up or down. So that means whenever prices increase or decrease, we will stay on the same aggregate demand curve, but will either move up or down based on the change in the prices. However, if the prices remain constant, any other factors that can affect the aggregate demand, they change, then the entire aggregate demand curve will either shift towards right or left. So what are the factors that can actually affect different components of aggregate demand? So consumer and business confidence, for example. So if you as a consumer or if you as a firm have confidence in the economy, then that means you are very confident with the economy and you are quite optimistic. So there will be more and more demand from your side in the economy. How the world is operating: if there would be a recession in one economy, we might have a fear of that recession coming in our economy, so then the aggregate demand would be less. It depends on the fiscal policy and monetary policy. I'll leave that explanation here because that would be the point that I'll be discussing in the next 2 lectures. So expectations depends on what you are expecting from the future prices. What happens? These are the different factors that can affect the aggregate demand. So if the interest rate goes up, that means C&I goes down because it's now expensive to borrow and hence it's expensive to invest. So income goes down or aggregate demand goes down. You can also call aggregate demand as the national income or real GDP curve. So Y, I can also denote the aggregate demand curve as Y. So aggregate demand curve will shift towards left. When government purchases increase, that means there is a positive relation between G and Y. Y is aggregate demand. So when government purchases increase, there would be more aggregate demand in the economy and hence the curve would shift towards right. When taxes increase means the disposable income goes down and hence aggregate demand shifts to the left. More of the net exports will lead to high income and hence aggregate demand shifts to the right. Consumption expenditure goes up, income goes up, aggregate demand goes up and hence curve shifts towards right. Likewise, if I goes up, Y goes up and aggregate demand shifts to the right. So aggregate demand will increase if C, I, G or NX increase, if taxes decrease, or if there would be low interest rates, because low interest rates means we can now borrow easily and hence will demand more goods and services, and when the Australian dollar depreciates or the dollar of the country depreciates. Aggregate supply. So let's shift to the second part of today's topic, that is understanding what is the aggregate supply curve. Aggregate supply curve is basically the curve that shows the effect of changes in the price level on the quantity of goods and services that firms are willing and able to supply. So now we are talking about the relation between the price level in the economy and firms or the quantity or the real GDP being supplied by the economies, or the total output being supplied by the firms in the economy. So because the effect of changes in price level will be different in the short run and the long run, so we'll have to have two supply curves, short run supply curve and long run supply curve. And again, a note that aggregate supply curve is not the micro supply curve. It's different. Though you can use the same understanding of micro supply curve here, but they're different. Don't assume they're same. So aggregate supply curve represents the relationship, and the relationship is negative basically. Sorry, positive here. So it represents the positive relationship between the price level and the total quantity of output that firms are willing to produce. Definitely, if the price level goes up, the profit margin goes up, and firms are willing to supply more. So the real GDP supplied in the economy would go up. Now, firstly, the short-run aggregate supply curve, it is upward sloping because over the short run there is a positive relation between prices and the output that the firms are willing to supply. So this would be a positively sloping curve. So basically we take a real GDP here, or you can also call it as output or Y, and we take prices here. So if the prices go up, the real GDP or the output supplied in the economy shifts towards the right, and hence this is a positively sloping curve. Aggregate supply will increase. That means there will be a shift in the aggregate supply towards the right if any of these vectors or all of these vectors happen. So if the labor increases or if the capital increases, then there would be more supply in the economy. If the productivity increases, there will be more supply in the economy. If the firms are expecting that in the future the price is going to go down, then they would tend to supply more now. So aggregate supply increases. If the technology improves, the aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply increases. So factors that can shift the aggregate supply curve: if the labor force or capital increases, aggregate supply shifts towards right. Technology improves, curve shifts to right. If there is a fall in expected future prices, the aggregate supply goes up for now, and the curve shifts towards right. Other factors that can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. So aggregate supply curve would now we are talking about shift towards left. So higher expected inflation will shift the aggregate supply curve, basically the short-run aggregate supply curve towards left. If there is a price shock, that means for example, there is an increase in oil prices. So oil could be a raw material that firms use in manufacturing further many products. So the cost of production goes up, and hence, for example, oil is being used in the transportation. So transportation cost goes up. That means for the firms, and that means the cost of production goes up, and hence the short-run supply curve would shift towards left. Long-run aggregate supply curve. This is basically a vertical supply curve. When I say this is a vertical curve, that means this is fixed at a certain level, and because this is fixed, this is vertical, that means this potential level of GDP or the GDP level at long-run aggregate supply, this is independent of changes in the prices. So before I explain that, let's try to understand what does it indicate. So long-run aggregate supply curve indicates the relation in the long run between the price level and the quantity of real GDP supplied. So the same relationship as the short-run aggregate supply curve represents, but now the relationship would be in the long run. So the long run is a time frame where GDP, the real GDP or the actual GDP that you are producing is equal to the maximum possible GDP. That means potential GDP, and there is full employment in the economy. When I say full employment, remember the last chapter? So full employment will be a point where everybody who is looking for a job finds the job. So everybody is employed, and we are fully utilizing our resources. But even at the full employment level, there would be certain kind of natural rate of unemployment, which would be some frictional and some structural unemployment. So we don't consider that level of frictional and structural unemployment as bad. So we even with some sort of frictional and structural unemployment, we can claim that we are achieving the full employment level. So we're taking the price level here, and we're taking the real GDP on other axis. So this would be the long-run aggregate supply curve in 2010. 1,100 billions of dollars worth GDP we are producing in the economy, and the price level is, say for example, 100, and whatever happens to the prices, the long-run aggregate supply curve remains constant. But because we're talking about a long-run supply curve being constant, that is at a point in time. So during 1 year, the long run aggregate supply curve would be a vertical curve, and the prices cannot change that. But over the time period, say after 1 year or after 2 years, the potential output level that we can produce in the economy increases, and that increases maybe because the resources have increased, there is more labor force available to work, and there is more capital or machinery in the economy, technology has improved. So the potential GDP level, that means the maximum or the full employment level of GDP that we can produce using all the resources, that level can actually increase in the long run. So the long run aggregate supply after 1 year shifts to $1,140 billion. So that means the capacity to produce actually increases over the time period. But a point in time, the curve would be vertical. That means if we are talking about 1 year time period, the curve would be vertical, and so on. Factors that can shift the long run aggregate supply curve. There are 3 simple factors that can actually shift the long run aggregate supply curve. Number 1, if there would be more labor force in the economy. Number 2, if there would be more capital available or capital resources increase. And number 3, if there would be an improvement in the technology. So any positive change in any of these 3 factors or all of these 3 factors will shift the long run aggregate supply curve towards right. When potential GDP increases, both the long run aggregate supply and short run aggregate supply curves shift rightward. Obviously, if we can produce more, our capacity to produce more increases, then the curves shift towards right. Okay. Now let's talk about the general equilibrium with aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. General equilibrium would occur at a point where the aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, or where the quantity of aggregate demand is equal to the quantity of aggregate supply. So this would be the point where aggregate demand curve intersects with the aggregate supply curve. Now because we got 2 kinds of supply curves, short run and long run, and hence there will be 2 kinds of equilibrium in macroeconomics. One will be the short run equilibrium and another will be the long run equilibrium. So short run equilibrium first. This would be the equilibrium where the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply intersect. So this would be the equilibrium in the short run. The long run would be the equilibrium where basically short run aggregate supply is equal to aggregate demand, and this is further equal to long run aggregate supply curve. And this is the point where the real GDP, the GDP level that we are producing in the economy is equal to the maximum possible GDP that we could produce, or is equal to the potential GDP in the economy. So this is long run aggregate supply curve. The point where the 3 curves intersect would be the point of equilibrium. And this point here, because this is a long run equilibrium point, so definitely this is full employment or potential output level equilibrium. Okay, so short run equilibrium over time. So what happens to the short run equilibrium over time? We can't say that the equilibrium doesn't shift, or equilibrium, there won't be any equilibrium changes. Basically, there would be changes in short run equilibrium over time if some factors change. For example, let's say in the short run we are producing more than the potential output level. That means I can only use, say I can only produce $100 billion by using all my resources, but somehow I am in a position to produce more than $100 billion at a point in time. So what happens then? Basically, when I'm producing more than the potential output level means I'm overutilizing my resources. Overutilizing my resources means there is a tightness in labor markets because there is an excess demand of workers. So I'm using all my workers, plus I'm using some to work overtime, plus I'm paying some workers higher wages to work on weekends and public holidays, basically. So because there would be excess demand of workers in the market, and this can drive up the wages, which can further result in higher inflation and inflation expectations. So what would happen to the aggregate supply curve in the short run? It would shift up and towards left, because expected inflation means basically there are going to be high prices in future, and that means it's now a point where I would like to supply less and I would like to supply more in the future when the prices would be high. What happens if we are producing less than the potential level? That means we are not in a position to utilize all our resources efficiently. That means there is excess slack in the labor markets, because there is excess supply in the labor market and we have more choice as firms, that means the wages will go down and it will result in lower inflation and lower inflation expectations. So the aggregate supply curve for now will shift towards right. And this is also called the self-correcting mechanism, because if we are producing, ultimately what I'm trying to tell you here is the long run equilibrium is the equilibrium point which is sustainable, and if we, in the short run, if we are producing towards left or towards right, that means if we are producing less than the potential output or if we are producing more than the potential output, there is a self-correcting mechanism that works and ultimately will reach a point where the long run equilibrium is there and which is sustainable. So demand pull inflation, we already discussed this in the previous lecture. So inflation that is caused by an increase in aggregate demand, and there would be upward pressure on prices and nominal wages. So when the aggregate demand increases and the supply cannot match that aggregate demand, then there would be a pressure on prices, and this will lead to demand pull inflation. So let's have an example here. This is the long run equilibrium. An increase in aggregate demand shifts the aggregate demand towards right, causing demand pull inflation. So when the demand curve shifts towards right, we move from point A to B, and this leads to higher price level and real GDP increase. So when the prices increase from 108 to 112, this is basically an inflation that has been caused due to increase in aggregate demand, and because this was because of a higher demand in the economy, so this can be termed as demand pull inflation. Cost push inflation is from the supply side. So whenever there would be a supply shock, or whenever there would be increases in the prices of oil, increases in the wages, or increases in the indirect taxation, there would be less supply in the economy, and if there would be a shortage in the supply, ultimately it will lead to higher prices, because there is a shortage in the market, and high prices driven by the shortage in the supply curve will lead to cost push inflation concepts. An increase in production cost shifts the SRAS curve to left. That means we are now producing less at higher prices, and sometimes this is also known as a situation where the prices are increasing because of the oil price shock or the supply shock, or because of the supply shortage in the market. So cost push inflation. Okay. An example here, a natural disaster such as severe drought or flood can cause a supply shock, and this causes cost inflation. Again, if something happens in an economy like a flood or a drought, it might destroy the production in the economy, and it might lead to supply shock, which would again be considered as cost push inflation. So macroeconomic equilibrium is an equilibrium where aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply, and what can actually cause this macroeconomic equilibrium to change or shift? So what can cause the economy to experience a recession? A recession can be caused by either a decrease in aggregate demand or a decrease in aggregate supply. So we'll discuss both the cases. Now let's say there is a fall in aggregate demand. So fall in aggregate demand will mean that the aggregate demand will shift towards left, and new equilibrium will be at a point where the real GDP falls and the price level also falls. Let's see how. So a decline in investment. So let's see if I component of aggregate demand goes down. So this will shift the aggregate demand towards left, causing a recession. So the new equilibrium will move from A to B. So now what would happen? The firms and workers adjust to the price level being lower than expected. So basically the prices have decreased, and firms and workers, they did not expect this, so they'll try to adjust with these lower prices, and because the prices go down, hence wages will also go down, because we'll pay less to those workers. And this can also lead to a shift in SRAS curve towards right, because when the cost of production goes down, firms are in a position to supply more. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts towards right, and the equilibrium moves from B to C. So that means in the short run, so from A to B, we are talking about the short run effect of decrease in aggregate demand, whereas A to B and B to C, we are talking about long run effect of decrease in aggregate demand. So in the long run, though aggregate demand decreases, but it will lead to less wages being paid to workers because prices are decreasing, and hence lower cost of production, and ultimately an incentive for firms to produce more, which will ultimately lead to point C from B. Okay, so equilibrium moves back from B to C, which is again the potential GDP level. Recession, I told you, can also be caused by a decrease in aggregate supply. Let's see how. So the short-run impact would be, let's see, there is a supply shock and the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts towards left. So an increase in oil prices shifts the curve to the left, and we move from point A to B with the higher prices and less production. In the long run, however, what would happen will be the recession caused by the supply shock eventually lead to falling wages and prices. I told you that if there would be a recession, that means the recession was because of the supply shock. It can lead to fall in the wages and the prices in the long run and shift back the short-run supply curve to its original position. So equilibrium moves from B to the potential GDP at the original price level. So in the short run, we move from A to B, but in the long run, we come back again from B to A, and ultimately, in the long run, we always come back to the potential level GDP. If we're producing below full employment equilibrium, there is a gap there because we're producing less than the potential output level, and this gap is known as the recessionary gap. Let me show you how. So this is where the short-run aggregate supply curve and long-run aggregate supply curve should intersect. But basically, in the short run, the point of equilibrium is here. That means we are producing $860 billion, but we have the capacity to produce $900 billion of GDP. So we're producing less than the full employment level. That means there is a gap there, and this gap, because we're producing less, is known as recessionary gap. In the business cycle form, so this would be the actual GDP. So this is the actual GDP, and this is the trend line there. And this gap, that means we are producing less than the potential GDP, is known as recessionary gap. There is another kind of gap which is known as inflationary gap, and that happens if we are producing more than full employment equilibrium level, and that level is known as inflationary gap. So if we're producing, we should be producing at this level, but if somehow we can produce more than this, so what would happen? There would be a gap, and this gap would be known as inflationary gap, because this gap, this output level can only be produced at higher prices level. So if you want to produce beyond 900, there would be a pressure on workers, and hence higher wages, and hence higher prices, and that can only lead to inflation in the economy. So this was the recessionary gap, and if we are producing more than potential GDP, this would be the inflationary gap, basically. Okay. Now, the fluctuations in the aggregate demand. So real GDP can fluctuate as a result of changes in aggregate demand, and this could be in the short run and the long run. So we'll discuss how. So for example, there is an increase in aggregate demand. So this is the original equilibrium position. So aggregate demand curve shifts towards right. Okay, so that means we are producing more but at higher prices, right? So this, if the aggregate demand increases in the short run, there will be higher prices and more production in the economy. But again, an economy can't produce in excess of potential GDP without affecting the price level. So workers begin to demand higher wages, so wage rate rises, and it rises by the same percentage as the price level. So ultimately what happens is the long run impact, the short run aggregate supply shifts towards left, and we come back to a point where we are at the potential GDP level. So basically we shift from here to here, and then again from here to here. So we achieve the in the long run, whenever the aggregate demand increases, in the long run, the supply curve would also decrease, because there would be higher wages, and hence firms will be in a position to supply less, and hence the supply curve, short-term supply curve, will shift towards left, and it will take away the effect of increase in aggregate demand, and ultimately will achieve the long-run equilibrium. So what happens when there are fluctuations in the aggregate supply? Let's see if there is a decrease in aggregate supply. So the supply curve shifts towards left. So what can you see here? Higher prices and less production. So high prices and less production, but again this is only the short-run impact. And in the long run, we can have a situation where we ultimately achieve the long run or the potential output level, as I told you in the previous diagram. Now the last part of today's topic is what is the dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. When we talk about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, we make two assumptions basically, and the assumptions are: number one, the economy does not experience continuing inflation. That means we assume that the prices don't increase continuously. So that's an assumption that we need to make to understand aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. And we also assume that the economy does not experience long-run growth. So if you violate these two assumptions, or if we get rid of these two assumptions and we frame a new model, aggregate supply model, aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, by violating these two assumptions, that would be known as a dynamic aggregate demands and aggregate supply model. I'll show you how that works. So basically, we make some changes to our basic model. For example, we assume that the potential real GDP increases continuously. That means the long-run aggregate supply curve also shifts towards right continuously. And we also assume that during most years the aggregate demand curve will be shifting towards right, and the short-run aggregate supply curve will also be shifting towards right. So basically we are assuming that all the three curves they shift towards right. Okay, so dynamic aggregate demand supply model, this is the basic model, and this is what happens in a dynamic aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So now it's not only the short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand they are increasing, but the long-run aggregate supply curve also increases. So what happens here is, this is the original equilibrium, aggregate demand 1, long-run aggregate supply curve, and this is short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, this point of equilibrium. Now we are assuming that all the curves shift towards right over the time period. So let's say aggregate demand shifts from 81 to 82. At the same time, let's say supply curve shifts towards new level SRAS2. Now the third curve, long-run aggregate supply, also has a capacity to increase, so it also increases. So all three curves we assume shifts towards right, and we achieve a new equilibrium. Now, will this new equilibrium will result in higher prices? It depends. Okay, so here is the rule of the thumb. It says if the aggregate demand shifts to the right more than the long-run aggregate supply curve, then the price level would be rising. That means if the aggregate demand in the economy increases more than the increase in the long-run aggregate supply curve, then there would be a pressure on the prices and the price levels would increase. And if the aggregate demand curve shifts towards right less than the shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve, that means the supply increased more than the demand. So then there would be, in fact, price level declining in that case. So it all depends on basically how much is the amount of increase in aggregate demand and how much is the amount of increase in long-run aggregate supply curve. That would determine whether the demand curve will lead to, or the higher demand curve will lead to higher price levels or not. So this is a dynamic aggregate demand model where we try to have a situation where if we don't follow the assumptions, how we can achieve an equilibrium with all the curves shifting towards right. So that was it regarding aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. So basically, we need to understand with this topic, we need to understand that how the macroeconomic equilibrium gets determined. It gets determined at a point where the aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply. And if something happens to the business cycles, or if there are different phases of the business cycles, then these curves may shift, and hence these may result in higher prices or less price levels in the economy. So you read this, and I'll discuss the following part, or I'll discuss the application, or I'll discuss more examples in the workshop. So thank you so much for listening.